It's September. School vacations have ended and classes have started. Meanwhile, in Albany, the State Board of Regents is considering optional pathways to graduation and its search for a new education commissioner. I welcome my guest, the Chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents, Dr. Betty Rosa, to discuss how the board's work on these projects is progressing. Chancellor Betty Rosa, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. I know I mentioned to you the day you became Chancellor, I reached out to you, was hoping that we could do this, and here we are 4 years later. We finally made it happen. So, Commissioner Mary Ellen Elia rather suddenly announced that she was planning to resign her position as commissioner, immediately putting the Board of Regents on notice that they better be thinking about what they're going to look for in the next commissioner. So I want to ask you a few questions about that, because I assume you'll be leading that search. Mm-hmm. Have you thought about some of those personal and professional characteristics that are important to you and perhaps important to other members of the board as they search for a new commissioner?
Well, I have been on the board for 11 years, and so I have had the experience and the privilege of working with different commissioners and different styles and under different circumstances that they were placed in the position. And so I think in reflecting on the positives and the contributions each one has made to the position, it has given me an opportunity to begin to think with the board about the next steps. And so the first part is obviously reflecting on the contributions that Commissioner Elia has made to the landscape and this situation. And then how do you build on what's already been done and move that to the next step? And so the conversation right now with the board is trying to look at and take stock and look at the things that have worked well, and try to hold on to those, obviously. And what are the things that we want to add to the conversation for the next commissioner to engage in and continue the building stones and the next steps for the position.
So you've been on 11 years. Were you on when Commissioner Mills was still in office?
Absolutely.
Probably that last year or two with Mills.
I would say the last year and a half, 2 years,
Yeah,
yes.
okay, yeah.
Correct.
So Mills, then Steiner,
Correct.
then King, then Elia.
Correct.
And Mills was the only one who had been a commissioner, albeit in Vermont, before becoming commissioner in New York. The others had important positions, but never as state commissioner of education. Is that something that you think you're going to be looking for, somebody with that type of an experience?
I think we're pretty open to looking at the current position as it exists and the demands of the current position and trying to find a match for the work that is currently before us, and not necessarily looking at somebody with a particular prior experience, but rather finding the individual that has the skills, the knowledge base, the ability to communicate and articulate, obviously, the vision and mission that this state wants to see, and that obviously that the children are the focus of the work. So it's not necessarily the prior title or the credentials per se, but rather trying to find an individual that could take this state to the next level.
You need somebody who's the chief education officer for the state.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be a unique position, not easy to fill. Do you think it would be helpful that that person had some classroom experience?
Yes, and not just classroom. I think that classroom building experience is important. Sometimes when you obviously are in communication with various stakeholders, having had certain experience gives you an opportunity to share what those experiences have
Absolutely.
been, and it creates the opportunity for the kind of conversation that you've been there, you've done that,
Yeah.
and you know the pain points, and you also know the joy and the what it takes to think in those along those lines.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is going to be not an easy task for you guys, and bringing everybody together in agreement is going to be hard to do. Are there going to be some things that you think are going to be immediately major issues?
Absolutely. I think that just like when Commissioner Elia stepped into the role, we were in a very I would say challenging is a soft way of saying it. It was tempestuous. It was a time that we were facing many challenges with Common Core and looking at APPR and many of the issues that, by the way, we still are grappling with.
Sure.
So those issues, some of those issues have not disappeared, but certainly I think we have a better handle on those. So I do think that the issue of trying to identify an individual that can help us to look at and examine where the state needs to be, not only on a national basis, but also from a local basis, looking at all of our needs of all of our students, from rural, urban, suburban, or the combination. So I think the idea that we have somebody that has the depth of understanding of New York State would certainly be something I would be very interested in. Doesn't mean I'm not going to get ahead of the board, but I do think that having the knowledge of the very specific issues of New York State is key.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience, I moved here 21 years ago to take over this position from another state. And it took me about 2 years to really understand the landscape. And that was in my position. It does not have the same profile as the education commissioner, and perhaps not the same sort of pressures to get it done now. So I can understand why you're saying we want somebody who may be able to hit the ground running.
Well, but I also think, and I'm going to relay it back to my own experience, sitting as a region representing my judicial district, the Bronx, and then shifting to becoming chancellor and having to think about the state. Even though while I was sitting there, it was clear that I was representing New York State, but always in the back of my mind, I often thought about, well, what does this have to do with the children in the Bronx? And so shifting to a much more statewide philosophy and perspective was a shift, even for somebody who had sat there for a while. So I do think it's important that the person that comes into this position has at least, if nothing else, a deeper understanding of the needs of all of our communities in New York State.
And if they don't, they better get out there and find out. And I will give Commissioner Elia credit for she hit the road.
Absolutely.
And she went out everywhere, and she did everything she could to learn as much as she could about the different provincial interests around the state. And I suspect that that will be a high expectation for people around this state when the new commissioner arrives.
Well, I think she also had an advantage that she had been part of New York State before she left.
That's right. That's right.
So she was somebody who was going through a re-entry process, not necessarily coming from the outside.
Do you think you'll hire a search firm, a professional executive search firm, to help you out?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's important to have a search firm help us to think through a process that we know they use about what is it that, where are we reflecting on what our work looks like, what we've done, and moving forward into where do we want to be 5 years from now, And so what are the characteristics of the individual that all of us collectively, the values, the belief system. And I do think that having a search firm helps us because they do reach out to stakeholders and also elicit from them some of their concerns and some of the attributes and characteristics that they see as important.
I never told you this, but I did executive searches. I'm not interested, don't get me wrong, but I did executive searches for about 15 years, including searching for the Commissioner of Education in Ohio.
Okay.
And it was a wonderful experience working with the board. The governor was very much involved there and sat right at my side as we were conducting interviews and all of those sort of things. So but facilitating that process was, it was easier than I thought it was going to be because I had people on the board who were really smart and very dedicated to doing the right thing. And as long as you have that sense of team and cooperation and open-mindedness, you're going to find the right person, I'm sure of that. Do you have a timeline as to when you would hope this person would join you?
Well, we have clearly, and I have to give a shout out to Beth Berlin, who has agreed to, for the second time, to step into this role, and she's amazing, and we are grateful. And I want to thank her ahead of time for saying yes. We're hopeful to get through the next couple of months. I would say the last couple of, I would say Steiner took us anywhere between 5 and 6 months, 7 months. And I think Commissioner Ilya was pretty similar. And so I am less worried about having Beth in the position, Beth Berlin. I'm less worried about doing this in a specific timeline. I'm more focused on trying to really find the very, very best person.
You got that right. The fact that you have Beth Berlin there as your
Absolutely.
acting commissioner is a luxury. And it gives you that time to do this right and make sure you find the person who's right for us. Let's switch gears now. And I wish you the best of luck with that search.
Thank you.
Graduation requirements. You had made notice, and it actually was first published in our on-board newspaper, that you had an interest in taking a look at graduation requirements. And we agree that this is something that we need to look at. The dimes have changed. Kids and their needs and their interests and their futures have changed. And perhaps it is that time that we take a look at that. In fact, the question I have for you is, do you think the graduation requirements that are in place right now are too rigorous or too impractical for some students?
But before I answer that question, I am grateful that we were able to get the rethinking and reframing conversation, advancing it in obviously in your newspaper. And it generated some obviously misconceptions, as I did say in the article it would do. But any time that you can put something out and it generates concerns, but also a certain level of excitement and energy, you know that it's time. And we have received so many memos, letters, people interested in being part of the commission, but more importantly, research pieces from different places. We had Howard Everson, who said, "Oh my God, I really want to be a part of this." So the level of interest has been amazing, and it's been quite exciting. To answer your question, I don't know that it's so much about what we currently have. Is it too rigorous, or is it
Too impractical was my other word. Yeah.
I would say that I think it's not even on a personal level to respond to it. I don't think it's a question whether what we currently have is too rigorous. I don't think you could ever have a situation that you would classify, for some students, it may not even be rigorous enough. And for others, it may not even be a question of rigor, but maybe of practical practice. It may not be the right composite.
This
for
gets
their
us all
needs.
to this concept of multiple pathways.
Correct.
And that's what you're getting at. Not one size fits all. We got to go find kids where they're at and work with them from that point.
Absolutely, and multiple measures.
Yeah.
That it's the idea that we only measure in looking at a student's composite, measuring in using one or two or three different methodologies, I think is an incomplete story. And many of our students are shortchanged as a result of it because the talents can be displayed in so many different ways. And we want to encourage our schools, our districts, to look at students' successes in so many ways and opportunities, and for students to have a richer environment that takes their natural curiosity and extends it to a level that maybe in some cases we couldn't even imagine. So I think this is an opportunity to creatively think about, and that's why I called it rethinking, think about how do we reframe this conversation? How do we change the narrative from looking at, is this the right or the wrong? It doesn't have to be. It's how do we look at preparing back mapping kids into, for students who want to be ready for college. What does that mean? How do we have conversations with higher ed institutions and say, what does that look like? How do you help us inform our high schools of what you're looking for? How do we all engage in conversations about students that are going to go to work? What does that look like? Students that are going to go into higher ed? How do we give them the skills and prepare them to be successful? Because we've had those conversations and we know what it takes and what people are looking for.
Central to any conversation about graduation requirements, however, are the Regents tests. And they have been deemed as sacred here in New York.
I said it in the article,
Yeah.
the sacred, right?
Right.
Right.
And so
Right.
the question is, are we going to look at opening that option up of no longer having to pass X number of Regents tests? In fact, I will ask you, do you think the Regents tests are a good measure of student proficiency?
Now, it's interesting. I think that some people would say, particularly those people that have had experience, positive experience with the Regents, whether it's from 40, 50 years ago to those students that are having positive experience with it now, they would say hold on to them because they're meaningful and they were helpful. There are other students, this is one that we have had mixed reviews on, some teachers even saying, I'm teaching to the test versus using the time in a much more creative, project-based learning. So we are open to the dialogue, we're open to the conversation, we're open to exploring it. And I don't necessarily think it has to be an either or. There are ways of creating these amazing composites that these things you could still hold on to. It's a matter of how do you measure the successes, or how do you measure the learning? How do you measure the level of knowledge that students need to be ready for that next step? And so if this is one tool, then we should say, let's just create a toolbox that has more than just one tool.
It'll be interesting to have those conversations because you will go back in history and look at where did we come from, and you'll see that there was a time when there was a Regents exam,
Absolutely.
but there were local diplomas as well.
Correct.
And to what extent should we go back to there, or maybe drop these Regents? I graduated from high school in Michigan.
Right.
We didn't have
Right,
Regents
right,
exams.
right.
All right, I survived. But I am curious about, this is probably
Yeah.
somewhat a pushback against what people would say is a testing culture that we have nationwide, and we've seen the opt-out movement being very prevalent here in New York, other sorts of things, albeit on proficiency tests, not Regents tests. Pro-test takers would tell you that the tests inform instruction. Do you believe that?
I do believe that assessment and certain tests do inform instruction from the perspective of, for example, as a former teacher, there were times that I would give a test and they informed instruction for me because maybe I didn't do such a great job in delivering what I thought I was delivering because the results of the test didn't necessarily.
Obviously, they didn't get it.
Right.
Right.
So, so assessment is important to both for the student and for the teacher and the relationship that takes place. But I do think that taking that one snapshot is only an aspect. It isn't, I mean, I know that if on a given day I was taking a test as I did for my doctoral work, and if I had a toothache that day or if I wasn't 100%, obviously my performance is not going to be 100%. So does that capture my abilities at that given moment, that Kodak moment? It's kind of almost taking, Kodak. I'm really,
Right.
I'm showing my age, right?
Showing the love towards Rochester. There you go.
Right.
Yeah.
So on a given, in a given moment, you can take a snapshot of something, and it may not look like the kind of snapshot that really shows.
But we're going to
you're,
see, there's so much emphasis on individualized learning and the use of technology. And I think as time goes on, you're going to see more and more and more
Absolutely.
of these ways in which each child's going to hopefully operate at their own pace, test their skills one-on-one compared to where they are. And I think that's going to be probably the answer eventually. You've talked about the idea of pulling together some sort of a panel or blue ribbon commission or something like that. Do you think that's a methodology you're going to use to look at this?
Well, we are definitely committed to doing a blue ribbon commission.
I see.
We're also very committed to looking at the various stakeholders that are involved in this work. The other thing is the issue of looking at the local, the various local issues, and again, that goes to the heart of rural, urban, suburban, and making sure that we incorporate not only the various stakeholders, but incorporate the various research and the various partners, and from higher ed all the way to people who help us with the entry point in the early childhood. So it's looking at this work in its totality.
Are you thinking you're going to get into like standards and curriculum as well as graduation requirements?
Well, you almost have to look at, it's very hard to.
It's going to be a big job.
Absolutely.
So if you had to predict when you think the graduation requirements might change, how far out are we looking?
So ideally, I think we want to get started sometime in November, hopefully, and begin the conversations and build different timelines and benchmarks. And hopefully, our goal is for maybe taking stock a year and a half from now. So we're around the corner from 20. So 21, 22 may be a little bit more idealistic and realistic.
Well, we at the New York State School Boards Association view your Board of Regents as the State Board of Education, so to speak. And we recognize the importance of the work that you do in putting together standards and curriculum and having graduation requirements that we all can have faith in, helping create an educational environment here in New York that can make us proud. And so thank you for that. Thank you for being here today. And on behalf of the members of the New York State School Board Association, myself, Chancellor Betty Rosa, I really do appreciate the time we've spent here together.
Well, thank you
Thank
for
you
the
so much.
opportunity.
Thanks to my guest, Board of Regents Chancellor Dr. Betty Rosa. Have a good day.